Today's workshop is about paraphrasing. This is part of the Building Your Writing Foundation workshop series, an academic success center presentation. So let's begin here with our agenda. We're going to start today with a look at the differences between paraphrasing and summarizing, very briefly. Then we're going to move on to kind of introducing paraphrasing. We're going to look at the point of it, very briefly at the process, what this can look like for students. Next, we're going to talk about paraphrasing and plagiarism. And finally, we're going to talk about paraphrasing strategies, how we can paraphrase. We're going to walk through a 6-step process that you can apply to any text that you are attempting to paraphrase. So that's the plan for this workshop. And let's get started with paraphrasing versus summarizing. What is the difference? So when completing writing assignments, we always encourage students to read the instructions and rubric very carefully. Are you being asked to summarize or paraphrase? They are different. And what's the difference? So briefly, again, we're not going to go into all the differences between these two writing tasks, but briefly, summarizing requires the writer to identify and express the main ideas of the whole source. So this could be the entire article, an entire book, an entire video. Summaries condense the main ideas of a text into a shorter form. On the other hand, paraphrasing involves restating specific details or ideas from a source in the writer's own words. Paraphrases are usually about the same length as the original text, but that can, fluctuate a little bit. So something that's very important to remember, whether we are summarizing, the main ideas of a whole source or paraphrasing a chunk of text or an idea from a source, it is very important that the writer accurately represents the point of view of the original source. We cannot take information out of context. We cannot take information and change it to fit our idea in our writing assignment. We must retain the original idea or point of view of the author of the original text. That's something that's very important for both of these ideas or both of these skills. And this idea will come up again a little bit later. So now let's talk more about paraphrasing and what's the point? Why do we do this? When asked, what's the point of paraphrasing, students typically answer in these ways. I hear things like, to avoid plagiarism. It's about writing in my own words. Or something like, my instructor says they want us to paraphrase information. They don't want quotes, so we have to paraphrase when we use information from research. These are some of the kind of typical responses to, well, what is this skill? And I guess I have to use it for my writing assignment. And I think it's mostly about avoiding plagiarism. That's the one we hear the most. Now, to review, paraphrasing involves restating specific details or ideas from a source in the writer's own words. So you're restating, which means you're repeating, you're taking those details or ideas out of the source and incorporating them into your writing assignment, but you're saying them in your voice using vocabulary or language that is suitable. So some reasons that students may want to restate information from research may include adding detail, right? Adding depth and to a topic. That could be providing examples. Often we paraphrase information from research and build it into our writing assignment to support our opinion, right, with an expert's opinion. So the expert has written a study or an article or a book on a topic, and we take information from that source to show that we are right, that an expert supports our idea about our writing topic. The first step when you're paraphrasing is actually to read and do some research on your topic. We can't paraphrase something just from nothing. We have to find research that applies to what we're writing about, and then we can select details and ideas that fit our needs for this task and topic. It's also important, right, to think about that when we're writing, right, when we're paraphrasing, the writer will usually simplify complex ideas. Maybe they will choose appropriate language and vocabulary that fits the audience and the format of the writing assignment. So this is an important element of paraphrasing as well, kind of this idea of simplifying ideas and choosing language that fits our assignment. So let's discuss, what this process may be for students. Let's look at some examples of what this kind of general process could be like. So let's imagine we've got two students. We're going to look at two examples. We've got Mandeep from the Business Administration program, and we have Olu from the Social Innovation and Community Development program. Both of these students have been asked to do a writing assignment. They're in different programs, so different assignments, about the results of the 2023 provincial election in Manitoba. And they are asked to support their ideas with research. The students read the same CBC News article about the election. So, two different students, two programs, two separate writing tasks about the same topic. And so they end up finding the same CBC News article that applies to what they want to write about. And so both of these students are going to paraphrase information from this news article, but let's look at what that process may look like and how the format or the type of task they are being asked to write impacts this paraphrasing process. All right, so Mandeep is from the BA program and has been asked to write a business report. So Mandeep is interested in how the election will impact business owners in Manitoba. So they choose to paraphrase information from the article about that topic. So while researching and finding the CBC News article, we can assume that there's some information in that article about how this election is projected to impact local business owners, right? And so they find that information and pull it out. Next, Mandeep thinks about how a business report is typically a formal document, right? The audience for the report is local business owners. And considering the audience, Mandeep uses professional language, business appropriate vocabulary to paraphrase information from the article and include it in the report. Finally, Mandeep includes APA in-text citations and a reference to the CBC News article. As we'll talk about a little bit later in more detail, this is an essential part of paraphrasing to make sure that we give credit to the original source through the APA in-text citation and reference process. So that's what this paraphrasing process looked like for Mandeep. They wrote a business report, so they picked a topic, they researched the topic, and they chose information from that CBC article that fit the needs of the report. And then it was a formal writing piece, so they paraphrased it using professional business appropriate vocabulary because that suited their audience. So this is where I want to highlight just a note here about sometimes we think about paraphrasing as just being in our own words. And while it is true that paraphrasing does have to be a different way, right? We have to paraphrase information by writing it in a different way. Sometimes when we think about it as our own voice, that can be a bit confusing. In those cases, it really helps to think about who your audience for your writing task is and ensuring that the way that you paraphrase the information is not only in your own voice, but also suits the task and the audience. So we'll see that's a little bit different here for Olu. So Olu from Social Innovation, he's been asked to write a reflection discussion post. So a different writing assignment, same topic, different writing assignment. Olu wants to write about how the election will affect supports for low-income families. That's the topic he's going to choose to write about for this reflection discussion post that he's been assigned. So he reads the CBC News article and he finds information on this topic about, supports for low-income families and how the election is going to impact those supports. And he pulls that information out to paraphrase it for his reflection. Olu's instructor wants students to share the ideas very openly. They are welcomed to share their opinions, their thoughts, maybe their experiences. So the posts are informal, maybe very informal. the audience is Olu's peers and instructor. So when Olu paraphrases, he doesn't worry about sounding formal. He uses casual, informal vocabulary that he uses in everyday conversations, vocabulary that he's comfortable with as he's sharing his own opinions, his ideas. Even when he's paraphrasing the ideas from the CBC News article, he doesn't make it sound like a very, in contrast to Mandeep, a very formal or professional tone. He uses language that he is used to using. And important to note that even though the writing task is informal, Olu still includes APA in-text citations and a reference to the CBC News article in his discussion post. So this is something that's very important to note here. Even if your writing task is not maybe a very formal writing task, like a discussion post or whatever it might be that you're assigned that is less formal, some essays can even be less formal. You can have a reflective essay or an opinion essay where you're just being asked to share your thoughts and ideas. If you use information from research, from a different source, and you paraphrase it and include it in your writing assignment, you absolutely must include in-text citations and a reference. If you are interested in learning more about how to develop APA in-text citations and references, we have an additional workshop series that's posted on our RRC Polytech website called Writing with APA. So I encourage you to check that out. Let's talk a little bit about paraphrasing and plagiarism. As I mentioned before, students often respond to, questions about paraphrasing with something about, avoiding plagiarism or not getting accused of plagiarism because they paraphrased information instead of copying it word for word. So let's talk about this a little bit more. Whenever you paraphrase or quote someone else's words or ideas, you must give credit to the original author. All right, so for APA, this includes, like we've talked about, an in-text citation and a reference. If you don't give credit to the original author for their words or ideas, you are committing an act of academic dishonesty known as plagiarism. So by using someone else's idea in your own writing, you're not giving them the credit for the work that they've done. And by including an APA in-text citation and reference to the source, you are giving them credit. This is a totally excellent thing to do. Some students tend to think that by using someone else's ideas, it's kind of like cheating, or it's not as good as just writing the ideas as if it were all their own idea. That's not true. It is absolutely a good practice to go out and read and research about the topic you are writing about, and then use those experts' details and ideas in your writing. That is a great practice for writing assignments, but we have to remember to give credit through the in-text citation and references when using the APA style. And this, if you don't, that is when plagiarism happens. So often plagiarism is unintentional. Maybe students don't do it on purpose, but it does happen when credit is not given to the original author, as I said. Right? Sometimes students say that they can't remember where they got something, so they just didn't bother looking for it. Well, that's plagiarism. That idea came from an outside source, so you've got to give credit to that author. Another really common unintentional act of plagiarism is something called synonym swapping. So synonym swapping is an example of poor paraphrasing. So sometimes when students attempt to paraphrase information, they don't sufficiently paraphrase and the result is unfortunately plagiarism because the text is too close to what the original text said. So you may be plagiarizing without realizing it. Right? Paraphrasing well is very challenging, so students often rely on finding words with a similar meaning to rewrite text from a source, and this is called synonym swapping, when they just are looking, maybe word by word or little chunk by little chunk and trying to switch it to something else, right? Swapping in a synonym, that's synonym swapping. So we're going to look closer now at an example of synonym swapping. so that hopefully you can recognize this if this is something that you have done in the past or might attempt to do when trying to paraphrase. So the original text and then the paraphrase text. Look, I'm going to read those through, and you may note as I'm reading the paraphrase text how similar it is to the original. So let's take a look. So the original text says, students frequently overuse direct quotations in taking notes, and as a result, they overuse quotations in the final research paper. Probably only about 10% of your final manuscript should appear as directly quoted matter. Therefore, you should strive to limit the amount of exact transcribing of a source materials while taking notes. And the in-text citation there is Lester, 1996, and it has a page number included because it's a quote. So let's look at the paraphrase now. Students often use quotes while note-taking. This means that they use too many quotations in their last paper. It is likely that simply approximately 10% of your last paper should be quotes. In conclusion, you should attempt to lessen the number of quotes while note-taking. Lester, 1996. And this in-text citation does not have a page number because it's a paraphrase, not a quote. Again, you can learn more about that in our Writing with APA workshop series. So this is a kind of classic example of synonym swapping. Let's take it sentence by sentence. So the first chunk there in the original text, students frequently overuse direct quotations in taking notes. The paraphrase is students often use quotes while note-taking. So frequently has been changed to often, overuse has been changed to use, direct quotations has been changed to quotes, and in taking notes has been changed to while note-taking. Because this is a almost word for word synonym swap, this is not sufficiently paraphrased. You can see that for the next one too. Right? As a result, they overuse quotations. This means they use too many quotations. The blue, probably only about 10% of your final manuscript should appear as directly quoted matter. And the paraphrase says, it is likely that simply approximately 10% of your last paper should be quotes. You might notice there that that's a little bit of an awkward phrase. It is likely that simply approximately. It's a little bit wordy, right? With paraphrasing, something that we try to do is simplify, make something more concise and clear, focus on clarity to express the idea. And finally, the last sentence does the same thing, right? Therefore, you should strive to limit the amount, has been changed to you should attempt to lessen the number. It's very, very similar. So this happens, as I said before, when students maybe are not sure how to paraphrase or they don't understand what it means to paraphrase something. They just right-click in Microsoft Word and find a synonym that they think fits. This paraphrase, the meaning for the most part is still very similar to the original. However, sometimes synonym swapping can result in some really odd word choices as well, right? So that can be a danger of doing this. But ultimately, even though this is an attempt at paraphrasing, this would not be considered a paraphrase, and this would be considered plagiarism because of how similar it is in both wording, sentence structure, and order of information to the original text. So, to summarize these ideas, what can we learn from this example? Synonym swapping can result in inaccurate, strange vocabulary choices. Sometimes the text doesn't even make sense after synonym swapping. It can result in plagiarism, right? The meaning might be changed, and simply plagiarism because the writer has not adequately paraphrased. So, keeping that in mind, let's look at a good approach to paraphrasing. So the next time you have to paraphrase maybe a sentence, maybe a paragraph, maybe 3 paragraphs or more, how can you approach paraphrasing to avoid synonym swapping and avoid plagiarism? So let's look at these 6 steps. We're going to go through each of these and we're going to kind of create an example together as we go. And at the end, then we will see a final paraphrase that would be considered a good paraphrase as opposed to what we just saw, which would be not paraphrasing at all. So to paraphrase successfully, try following these 6 steps. Number 1, read to identify the topic and the main idea. Reading is a very, very important step here that sometimes students overlook. A quick scan of a text does not mean that you are ready to paraphrase. You must read to make sure that you understand what's going on. Then taking notes. This is an important step in this process as well. Take notes on relevant information. Then take a break. We'll talk about why that's important in a little bit. Then do the writing. Write your paraphrase. When you're done, add an in-text citation and reference. And finally, check. Check for plagiarism. So let's go through an example together. So step 1 is reading to identify the topic and the main idea. And yes, they are different. So the topic is the big idea that an author writes about. Usually a topic can be expressed in 1 or 2 words. It's the general subject of whatever you are reading or listening to. Could be the topic of a video as well, of course. The main idea, on the other hand, is a statement the author makes about the topic and what the text is mostly about, what the author is trying to say about the topic. The main idea can usually be expressed in a sentence or 2, and it's more specific, of course, than the general subject. So it's very important to take the time when reading or listening to a source to identify the topic and the main idea. If you don't understand it, you might end up misrepresenting the author's main idea, right? You might end up, when you take out a piece of information to paraphrase, right? When you're doing that selection process about what you are going to include in your writing task. If you don't understand the author's purpose or their main idea behind what they've written, when you remove something and when you take it out, you might end up changing it too much and actually, misrepresenting what the author wanted to say about the topic. So it's very important that you take the time to do this step. The next step is to take notes. So you've understood the main topic and you've understood the main idea or main ideas, and you've decided on what you want to paraphrase. Now, taking notes, right, is something that maybe some people like to do, some people don't. Some people have a lot of experience, others don't. But these are not the type of notes, you're not taking notes in a lecture to prepare for an exam. What you're doing here is you're reading a text and you're identifying what's important and you're putting that down into point form. When you do that process, you are not using full sentences. I would encourage you to try using as many symbols to replace words as possible. So you could use the word equals to show that 2 ideas are the same, or you could use equals to, write out a definition. That arrow symbol could result in, it could be about cause and effect. It could be this leads to this or this comes before that, right? So taking out verbs, taking out words and representing them with symbols. Of course, the plus symbol could represent a lot of ideas as well. Focus on the keywords. And at this point, if it's necessary, you could look up some synonyms for some of the terms used. But again, not the verbs, right? Only really focus on the key terms or key vocabulary within the text that you want to make sure you use in your final draft. This is also the time to look up words that you don't know. So maybe when you were reading and identifying the topic and the main idea, maybe there were chunks that you weren't sure about. This is the time to go look them up and make sure that you have a very solid understanding of that if you haven't done that already. And a very important step of taking notes is, of course, to not write down the stuff that's not important. So if you're looking at a longer text, don't include all the details. Try to think critically about what you're going to want in your final paraphrase. Do you need that? Do you want to add that example? Do you want to add that part of the list or part of the sentence? Do you need it? And if you omit it, don't include it in your notes. Only include the stuff in your notes that is going to be relevant when you're writing your final draft of your paraphrase. So once you've got those notes, the next step will be to take a break, and we'll talk about why. But let's look at an example of steps 1 and 2. So let's go back to our quote about students using quotes from the Leicester source. So the topic would be, students using quotes. That's what Leicester is writing about. The main idea, right? So the thing that the Leicester source is wanting to express about students and quotes is students should avoid using direct quotes in their notes so that they don't overuse quotes in their papers. That kind of cause and effect, that it's almost a caution against using quotes so that when you write a paper, you don't include tons and tons of quotes. That's the main idea. That's what he's saying about this overall topic about students and quotes. So if I asked you to write notes about this, everyone's notes would probably look a little bit different, but here's an example of what they could look like. So students, X quotes in notes, arrow, too many quotes in papers, quotes max 10%, and then a little note about the source, where you got it. This is, of course, a very important thing to remember when taking notes so that things don't get lost or accidentally attributed to the wrong source. That can happen too. So keeping your notes very organized when you're preparing to paraphrase is important as well. So again, your notes might look very different, and that's okay. But I believe that these notes accurately capture kind of the key terms and some of the key details that I want to include in my writing task. So take a break. It is very challenging to paraphrase when the original text is fresh in your mind. So taking a break allows you to forget the details and the exact wording of that original text. When I talk to students about their paraphrasing process, often they say that they read the original and then just try to write something new. That is probably the most common kind of process that is shared with me. The problem with that is it's going to be very tough to write something that you feel is good enough. When you have that original in front of you, that original is always going to feel like the better one. It's going to feel like it's worded better and that the phrasing is so elegant and good and clear, and yours might feel either really simple or really clunky or whatever it may be. It's very tough to look back and forth from the original to your paraphrase and come up with something that you feel good about. Even the most confident writers would have a hard time doing that without some struggle. So taking a break, maybe work on something else for a little bit, take a quick walk, get a glass of water, work on it tomorrow if you can. All of these things will distract you, hopefully enough that you don't remember what the original said, and then you can write. And when you write, only use your notes. Do not look back at the original. So after your break, you sit down to write your paraphrase. Don't look at the original right now. Leave it away. Don't review it. Don't check it. Rely only on your notes. Some other tips I give students at this stage is that they can talk about it out loud. Maybe you've got someone who you can ask to sit down with you and you can explain this topic using your notes. Maybe you just want to talk out loud to yourself at home in front of your laptop and just kind of try to generate some sentences that way. Sometimes people find it easier to verbalize an idea than it is to write down on paper, and verbalizing it can get the ideas flowing. So don't look at the original, just use your notes and see what happens. Sometimes I encourage students to start at the bottom of their notes and try working up. Right? Sometimes starting in the middle and going down and back. Starting not at the top of your notes might be helpful to really break the pattern of the original text. So that's another tip that often comes in handy too. So once you've paraphrased, maybe you have to write it out a couple times, right? It's drafting, that happens. That's a good thing, in fact. But when you think you're good with it, you make sure that you add that in-text citation and reference. Because like we've talked about many times today, that is an essential part of not being accused of plagiarism, right? You're giving credit to the author and you're making sure that the ideas have a source. Okay, so let's look at what this could be. So back to our notes, right? These were the notes that we took before. And a paraphrase could be, right? This is not the only way this paraphrase This could be written many different ways, but I chose to write it this way. Students should avoid using quotes in their notes because this results in too many quotes in their papers. Quotes should only make up 10% of a paper. That's one way you could do it. Maybe you could start at the bottom of the notes, right? You could start with quotes should only take up 10% of student papers. Therefore, students should avoid using quotes in their notes, right? You could reverse it as well. And again, this is not the only way to paraphrase this, but this is a good example of a paraphrase. And we'll walk through our little checklist for checking for plagiarism in a moment. But I also want to point out that there's an in-text citation, Leicester 1996, at the end of that paraphrase, and the reference, which would go at the end of your writing task in a reference list, but it's listed here at the bottom of the slide, just as an example. All right, so the final step is going to be checking for plagiarism. So this is when you can pull the original out again. You can compare the original to your paraphrase and look for any examples of synonym swapping. Are there any chunks where you've just kind of taken some of the words and flipped them into a different synonym? Do you have any chunks that are the same, right? Maybe 3 or more words. That's not an official rule, but that's often something I encourage students to kind of apply because it really forces you to look at, chunk by chunk in your paraphrase. Have you used any words in the same order and form as the original? Look for sentences that have a similar structure. If you think back to our synonym swapping example, all of those sentences had a very similar structure. The words and the ideas were in the same order. And as the information discussed in the same order, again, maybe you need to start at the end or somewhere in the middle to move the information around to help you come up with a new way of expressing those details or ideas. And remember, whether summarizing or paraphrasing, you have to make sure that you're accurately representing the point of view. So this is something you should be checking for as well. Have I, in the process of paraphrasing, is it possible that I've changed it too much and now the ideas are different? Right? Again, that's that kind of an example of accidental plagiarism that we talked about before. So if I look at the original and the paraphrase, are they expressing the same idea? Have I taken it out of context too much? So that's something you really have to check out. All right, so if we were to take the original and our paraphrase, here's a things that a checklist that we could go through. There are not 3 words in the same order or form. The sentence structures are different. The information is in a similar order, but some information has been omitted. And again, we talked about maybe you could start with the quotes only make up 10%. You could move it around a little bit. The meaning is the same. I have not changed the source's point of view. The paraphrase text is simpler and more concise than the original, which is great. As I said at the beginning of this workshop, paraphrases are often a similar length, but they don't have to be. They can be a little longer, a little shorter, depending again on how you're expressing the ideas. And the paraphrase text includes a citation for the original source at the end. So that's an important thing to check off as well. So in summary, paraphrasing is more than just something you do to avoid plagiarism. Paraphrasing involves restating specific details or ideas from a source in the writer's own words. When writing the paraphrased information, the writer usually should attempt to simplify complex ideas and think about choosing appropriate language and appropriate vocabulary that fits the audience for the writing task and the format of the writing task. So I think back to our examples of Mandeep and Olu and how they had different formats and different audiences, but they still went through the paraphrasing process. Synonym swapping is not paraphrasing. And finally, when paraphrasing, try using these steps. Read to identify the topic and main idea. Take brief notes. Walk away and take a break. Write using your notes and add an in-text citation and reference. And finally, refer back to the original to check for plagiarism. Thank you very much for listening to this workshop on paraphrasing, part of our Building Your Writing Foundation workshop series. I hope you all enjoyed.